Welcome back to Florida's Civic Literacy Exam podcast. Today, we're thrilled to bring you an extraordinary guest who's here to get into critical thinking, civic responsibility, and how to approach thinking about what we're thinking about. That's so meta. Joining us is Dr. Charles Russo, a nationally recognized expert in criminal justice, intelligence analysis, and critical thinking. Dr. Russo is a retired FBI intelligence analyst and U.S. military veteran. He brings over 30 years of real-world experience to the table. I met Dr. Russo at a conference because he is also a professor, speaker, and new author of his recently published book, Precision in Perspective, Critical Thinking for Analytical Minds, which is reshaping how professionals tackle complex challenges. I just got his book on Amazon last week and enjoyed reading it. You can learn more about his work at drcharlesrusso.com and check out his insights on his podcast, Dr. Charles M. Russo at Substack. So get ready for an engaging conversation that will sharpen your mind and boost your civic literacy. So let's dive in with Dr. Charles Russo. Hey, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here and be able to talk to you and really, get out more about critical thinking.
Dr. Russo, let's start by why I'm thrilled to have you on the show today. See, we've got this civic literacy exam here in Florida, and undergraduates have to take this. They have to pass to graduate. And so my colleague Samantha and I put together this podcast test prep. But here's the catch. The concepts that we are covering are way more important than a 10-minute overview or a 60-second soundbite. And that occurred to me that, we cover landmark Supreme Court cases. And hey, these are really heavy topics that have intense emotional media appeal, like the burning of the American flag in Texas versus Johnson. Why I'm getting at this is in your book, Precision in Perspective, you highlight the importance of public discourse, stating the absence of declining critical skills makes us vulnerable to manipulation and, in essence, quote, right out of your book, a society that devalues critical thinking becomes easier to control. So let's dive into your book and see what some of your thoughts are about. Give us an overview. What is critical thinking?
Thinking, I tell, my students and individuals who ask that question in a nutshell, without getting into the technical jargon, that critical thinking is thinking about thinking while you're thinking about thinking. It sounds, rather sarcastic in a way, but you really have to be thinking whether you are the one that is trying to problem solve or you're having a discussion or a debate with someone. And critical thinking is taking in, it's part of that active listening. It's looking at what facts are you going to argue, what are maybe the facts that the individual you're having a discussion with, what they are espousing as facts. Now remember, facts don't necessarily lead to truth is subjective. That is the reason that we have Supreme Court to interpret the laws. That's why we have opinions by our Supreme Court justices. They have to really think about what is the argument. And so when I look at critical thinking, it is just about understanding what is the argumentation, what are the facts, but also knowing that what are my biases and trying to understand the other individual's biases, assumptions, preconceived notions. And that is all part of that machination of thinking about thinking while thinking about thinking.
Yeah, that's why I had to say that's so meta. Ooh, so you brought up the word bias. Yeah, we all have our biases, and even when I'm writing these podcast episodes for the civic literacy exam, I have to think about what I'm thinking about and make sure that I'm presenting the landmark Supreme Court case in a way that doesn't reflect my bias. And 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 I kind of have to reset myself and put aside my emotions and detach, emotionally detach, so that I can objectively talk about uh, you know, the one that I brought up earlier was Texas versus Johnson, where a man burned the American flag, and so there's a lot of opinions about this. Talk about bias. I'd like to know more.
Thank you. Yes, I don't want critical thinking to be thought as some sterile process. You bring up some really great points, especially in some terms. I always think words have consequences. There's times that we make statements and it hurts somebody, and we say, you know what, that's not the way I meant it. That is part of our critical thinking, and it's part of our process. Now, we have emotion. You brought up emotional words and having debates in civil discourse. Yes, I think we're in a pivotal time in the last decade, and I think we're still going to see it for another decade for sure until something radically changes with education. And I think even not just, I'm not saying K through 12 or even higher education. I think education of ourselves. And that was part of the catalyst of me writing this book and kind of getting it out there to everyone, is that we have a lot of emotional words. I always try to stay away from opinion, belief, and I gear myself towards thoughts, ideas, and perspectives. Because those are a little more, while they sound academic, they tend to focus us on what are what is the information that I personally know. Of course, when bias comes in all shapes and forms. I mean, we are individuals who are bombarded with misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. Well, yes, you're right. We have our own bias, and our own bias is going to come through our lived experiences, where we grew up, how we grew up, and it's all those variables, right? Whether we came from a two-parent household, one parent, grandparents were and cousins or aunts and uncles were highly involved in the family unit, or whether you were just a family that was separated, by distance, whether you were born and raised in a time of technological advancements, so, but we also have to think about the socioeconomic, everything from religious affiliation to our values, and they could be political values, they could be our own family tradition values, and of course, then you got to think of our cultural and societal values. Understanding your own bias can go a long way into helping you formulate your thought process and understanding how you are going to. And I don't like the word argument. I like the word discussion. Robert Quinlan had authored a phrase that arguments are based in ignorance and discussion is based in perspectives. And I really look at that as, if we say argument, yeah, that's really something that, are we really thinking, or are we looking at more emotion? And that's where our bias comes in. I have to be right because I was brought up that way.
I right before we started this podcast, Dr. Russo and I were talking about this internal human condition where we want to be right. Now, I fortunately there was a quote that came up. It was, "Would you rather be right or would you rather be happy?" And so today I can control my tongue and go back and think about what I'm thinking about, and preserve relationships. And that's a new perspective for me. And so that kind of leads into the Dunning-Kruger effect. Uh, Dunning-Kruger effect, Doc, what do you think?
In this day and age, you almost pretty much everyone I talk to has never heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, except that we've lived it. You live it almost every day. And that's that is something I really wanted to get out and go, okay, the psychologists of David Dunning and Justin Kruger in the late 1990s really coined this effect. And they're the actual experts. I mean, they're not self-declared ones, but they the effect itself described the phenomenon where people with limited knowledge on a subject or the ability greatly overestimated their own competence. This is that individual who just thinks that they know everything or they know something on a topic. Especially these days, don't we have that with keyboard warriors and social media? They say, I've done my research. I looked at TikTok videos or I went to YouTube.
That is so true. I was thinking I'd like to bring this up. So we have a commonality here. I worked as an English teacher in a juvenile detention facility, and you worked in as a juvenile probation officer. And the
Mhm.
Dunning-Kruger effect was very abundant inside the walls. And one of my favorite examples when I was reading your book, I thought, my goodness, this is what happened. I'm teaching English and I'm using sports articles to teach English. So because I'm trying to meet the boys mod with some interest here, but it ends up breaking out in complete argument of which sports football guy is better than the other sports football guy, and I'm like, okay, regroup. So the next day, I'm like, no more sports, right? That caused argument. So now I'm changing my topic to animals. So we're gonna read about like the 10 most dangerous animals, or the hippopotamus, the lion, or the cobra. I don't know, something like that. Next thing you know, there's an argument that bursts out about cobra versus alligator. So who would win? And it's just the same exact day, different topic. It just became it was beyond debate at that point. But there was one example in the juvenile detention classroom. I'm sure you have some prime examples yourself.
Yes. I've had individuals that I've sat down and talked to. Of course, again, these are juveniles, anywhere between 12 and 18. They haven't lived the world. Most of them, if I ask them about reading, they're reading's overrated. But they will want to argue with, and I use that word argue
Okay.
again. Well, I talked to somebody in here who's been studying the law, and you obviously don't know it. That, or I watched a documentary on exactly what my case is, and you're just like, okay. And experts are overrated when you try to say, well, you got to listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. And you're like, no, you don't. Just because you've been doing X, Y, or Z. And so it's, it's almost comical to a point because again these are juveniles and so how do you get through to them? It's that they have to, I think, come up with things on their own, of the realization of I know enough just to argue with someone, but at what point do I stop? Or the reality hits that wait, this argument's harder than I thought. So
That's excellent. That leads me to a discussion, a story you were telling me about how you can ask as an adult, and I had distinguished between adult age people and the wisdom of adults, um, that you had led a young person, you had modeled metacognition by using guiding questions. And so let's say we find ourselves we're listening to one of these podcasts about US versus Lopez, which is a high school young man brings a gun to school, and then this court case, he gets arrested. But then this court case goes all the way to the US Supreme Court. And you can check out that episode if you're listening now to find out more about it. But here's the thing, let's say you listen to the episode, you go home to talk to your roommate, and they're like, well, I think this about guns in schools. And you're like, no, no, no. The premise ended up being the commerce class, which was something totally different than guns in schools. And then you get in an argument. Well, how do you, on my side, if I'm studying for this and I'm trying to talk about these topics with my colleagues, how do I, what are some tools or some questions that I can ask myself or use in to switch to discourse and debate?
This is where I would say we have to start if we're going to take control of this discussion, because two people can't be in charge. You can always be the higher level thinker and not necessarily be in charge. But you're right. It's about framing. And it's to me, it's saying if we have to start on the same page. And it's asking those probing questions because you've already learned that the other side has some bias. They've already let their emotions come out, so you kind of already know the way that their argument is framed. But you want to make sure that you are on the same page, without sounding like you're either being complacent and you're just gonna like just want to talk about it but not get deep, or that you are going to be so adversarial with them that, well, the argument's over, even if because you're not going to get a word in edgewise, right? That you want to be able to say, okay, let me understand, this is what you're saying is the centerpiece. Again, words have consequences. So I think you understanding what language you're talking and understanding their language, there has to be that meeting in the middle of an understanding. And this is where civil discourse takes sharp turns from one another, is setting that tone of, are we comparing apples and apples or apples and oranges? And we need to be able to set that out. And you get to take control of that without really showing you're in control. It's active listening. I heard what you're saying, but I just want to make sure I'm clear. And so you're leading them to that point. You can really understand what the argument is. You're also pausing to allow yourself time, as well as them, because they may want to just truly just start to give you the points. You can really start to pause and formulate your next thought. And that is a critical part of thinking and contemplation.
I like that. I had heard in a different ways, like pause, pray, proceed. The pause is the most important part, because when we're emotionalized, then then we're loose. We have looser tongues. But if we pause, we can practice that metacognition, where we're thinking about what we're thinking about and connect those consequences that are on the other side of those delivery of those words.
You can use that as almost like a diffusing a situation. You get to pivot when you're, like you said, pause, pray, and get to pivot a little bit, depending on where they come back from on that emotional side.
This is good stuff, because I was very concerned when we started uh, unleashing these podcasts, and literally we went in, we're like, oh, there's this really big exam, it has no support. Let's create some exam prep, podcasts, and we start releasing them. And about 20 podcasts in, I was like, hey Samantha, this is really heavy stuff. this is this is bigger than an exam. I listened to your talk on stoicism, and then I bought your book. So at the end of your book, the last chapter is titled Practice Precision in Thought and Purpose in Action. What do you give me some details on that?
When I really looked at individuals and we talk about what it is to be a critical thinker, you just can't say, you know what, I'm just going to think about things a little bit deeper. To me, it is a skill set. They're not traits, they're skills. And we have to live those every day. And it is in our action, in everything we do, from, making that decision of what am I going to eat for breakfast? I know it sounds a little out there, but, even to how are we going to feel when we turn on the news and we want to, even ourselves want to make a place of how do I feel about that? because again, everybody has their agendas. There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and being an active part of that in your daily life is setting it into action. Just like the philosophers, the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, in order to really. Well, Seneca had coined the phrase of what is a good man? To be a good man is to be one, and that is to practice and to be a critical thinker. That's exactly what I set out to help individuals put this into motion.
I definitely, while reading your book, was thinking about how well it pairs with the Florida Civic Literacy podcast, and not just even for exam prep, but it's because there are some hard topics, hard topics to think about, and lots of considerations that, well, as we walk through considering your bias, having some metacognitive thinking about it, and I was picturing it that a small group could work through your book in a chapter, because I'm a teacher, right? Could could work through your book chapter by chapter, listen to one of the court cases, read a chapter, and then you have some questions at the end of the chapters, and work through that. So you could do it on your own, but it would also be really good practice to exercise these critical thinking skills in a small group among, either diverse group or among friends. Okay, so you can have some safe space to be like, "Oh, I take that back," or so that you can practice. We're about to wrap it up. So after all of this, are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Really have a passion for individuals who want to better themselves. And what better way than to start thinking critically about the world we live in? I think that if, it's not a utopian society, and I don't expect that to happen, but being able just to sit down with another person and practice critical thinking skills does have a change on the other individual, especially if you can show that the point of view and perspective you're coming from is calm. It makes sense, common sense, but yet is very focused and almost persuasive to the point where if they come away with that aha moment, doesn't mean that you won and you're not in a competition. Even if you made them go, that's interesting, then you've passed along a skill. And that's exactly what I love seeing in individuals that I've mentored or individuals that I have come in contact with, even graduate and doctoral students, even myself. There are times that I have to say, I go, very interesting, because I've taken that pause and I've learned something from it rather than go, I should have just said something. The better, you know, reaction was, that's interesting. And I'll have to get back to you on that.
Mhm. I do like on my side, oh, I'm like, oh, and that can be delivered all kinds of ways. Oh, and let me think about that. That those are two that have served me well when maybe internally I'm floored and I'm having a reaction on the inside, but I want to respond in a non-inflammatory way. I guess that's one way to say it. But this is good stuff, and I was very concerned as we dove into these landmark Supreme Court cases. And one of the things that has been very uplifting is to see the comments on our YouTube channel, because they come from all different types of people and backgrounds, and it makes me think about a lot of things that a lot of thoughts I've never been exposed to. But if you want to have a voice and you want to be heard, leave us a comment on our YouTube channel. But hey, Dr. Russo, where can we find you on social media, and where can we buy your book?
Well, thank you. Yes, one, you can buy my book on Amazon. You can also find me on Substack. I love writing about critical thinking, and it's Dr. Charles M. Russo at substack.com. And then also my website, drcharlesrusso.com, where you'll see everything from previous writings to, yep, you got it, the link to my book. But, I thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. And, again, thank you.
Hey, well, thank you for coming on the show today to discuss precision and perspective, critical thinking for analytical minds. Right here, I wrote all over this book. You can find this on Amazon, like Dr. Russo said. And I think, like I mentioned before, that I think this book would pair great with my podcast because we got some hot topics that you can critical think about. Do check out his podcast at Dr. Charles M. Russo on Substack. That's it for today. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto, and I'll catch you next time. Until then, keep asking those big, big questions, and don't forget to share your critical thinking, metacognitive thoughts with me in the comments. You know, I'd love to hear from you. So check us out on Spotify and YouTube. And hey, thanks for listening. See you next time. This is Mercedes Musto and Dr. Russo signing off.